Good evening. Welcome to tonight's program. I'm Kelly Wright, and I'm so glad that you could join us as we spend this next hour delving into the COVID 19 global pandemic, which continues to disrupt our lives. My opening observations tonight are this coronavirus continues to adversely impact African Americans due to our health disparities. One of the questions we'll raise tonight is, should there be more testing? And that answer is a resounding yes. We'll talk about that. Another thing we're going to discuss tonight and should observe is what's going on in the prison population. Are we spending enough time to treat the prisoners? Are we spending enough time to help those incarcerated? We'll be talking to someone tonight who will say that we are on the tipping point of a humanitarian crisis as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic sweeping through our prison population. And that's my opening observation. I'm so pleased to introduce my first guest. Many of you who watch this show know that he's a good friend of mine, and he's on quite a bit because he brings so much good information that we all need. He is Dr. Benjamin Chavis, President and CEO of NNPA, Black Press USA. Doc, good of you to join us this day. And there's so much going on with this COVID-19 global pandemic. We know that it's impacting African Americans adversely, as we had indicated and predicted on this show before anyone really got on it. That's not a bragging right, but that's just a fact that we were out there in front of it to try to help the Black community get prepared. What do we do now that it's still going on?
Thank you, Kelly. It's always glad to be back on your show, and greetings from blackpressusa.com, the nation's black press with the NNPA. You're right. We're not even in the middle of it. I think the curve, they say that the curve is flattening in some communities, but it's not flattening in Black America. We're still on an incline, and the fatalities are growing. The morbidity rate in Black America is so devastating to all of the areas where Black Americans are concentrated, in the Northeast, in the Southeast, in the Midwest, on the West Coast, all over the country. There's no region that does not have the coronavirus, and there's no region where African Americans are not at the tipping point of the most fatalities and the most devastation. So what we have to do by giving out information, Kelly, to answer your question, we have to still remind our people that they should not go outside without wearing a mask. They have to wash their hands 3 or 4 times a day. They have to wash the hard surfaces in their abodes, in their dwellings, in their homes, in their apartments, in their cars. If they venture out in their car, you have to wipe it down. You cannot take this virus lightly. It stays on surfaces much longer than people thought. And as we've discussed, the airborne nature of it, it means that you can even be 6 feet apart, and still, if you're vulnerable, that means if you have diabetes, if you have heart disease, if you have hypertension, even if you have asthma, anything that involves respiratory illness, you can be much more susceptible to being infected by the virus. So we have to be vigilant. But also, I would say at this time, Kelly, I think it's time for us to call for increased testing among Black Americans, because as some governments at the state level, and certainly the federal government is trying to rush to reopen, quote unquote, America, and they talk about the new normal, I think it's the new abnormal, not the new normal. Because first of all, racism is abnormal, it's not normal. Racial discrimination is abnormal, it's not normal. And we know that it was this pattern of health disparities and racial discrimination in our communities prior to the coronavirus. Well, that hasn't gone away. And I think I would just appeal to everyone listening on the Black News Channel, on the Kelly Wright Show, to be vigilant, to be observant, and to take the measures that have been recommended to protect yourself, protect your family. So sad, in some cities, in Detroit and St. Louis, whole families have been affected because of their exposure to the virus. So I think we just have to be vigilant. This is not going to be a quick fix, Kelly. It's going to take months before we are properly healed and restored to some sense of, again, I hate to use the term normality, because our situation was abnormal before the virus.
I'd like you to stay with me for the next segment as well, Doc, because it's so disturbing what's happening out there. The trend for African Americans is not good in our communities, and I'm glad you're bringing that to light, as well as other guests who have been on this show. So stay with me after the break, and we'll come back with more of Dr. Benjamin Chavis. You're watching the Kelly Wright Show. Back after this. Welcome back to the program. I'm talking to my good friend, Dr. Benjamin Chavis, who, of course, is the president and CEO of the NNPA, the Black Press USA. And Dr. Black Press USA, like the Black News Channel, has played a very important role throughout this COVID-19 global pandemic, in that we have been sounding the alarm to Black Americans to not only be prepared for this coronavirus pandemic, but also to exercise all due diligence and vigilance in taking care of themselves. And sadly, we have seen some people take it for granted and they haven't followed the guidelines. What do you say, what can we say to people who aren't really grasping how serious this is for not only our community, but the communities at large?
Well, I think anyone, whether they're Black, white, Latino, whatever your racial ethnic background, if you're taking the coronavirus lightly, you're putting your own life on the line. This disease will kill you. This pandemic will kill you, and it will kill your loved ones if you do not take proper precautions. So I would appeal to all of the listeners not to take this lightly. This is serious. This is about life and death. But you can prevent death if you take the proper measures. You can prevent being infected if you take the proper measures that have been recommended. But I want, Kelly, we've established the National Coronavirus Task Force and Resource Center through the NNPA. And one of the things we are noticing now, is being reported to us, is the disparities in testing. African Americans are not getting the tests in the volume and the quantity that we need to be tested, because there are some people who are asymptomatic, meaning they don't have the symptoms, but they have the disease. And you will never know that you're infected with coronavirus if you're asymptomatic, if you don't be tested. So I would implore anyone who has the ability and the capacity to get tested, get your physician to ask that you be tested. They have all different kinds of tests coming out now. Some haven't been properly approved by the FDA, so it's a caution. So make sure you follow the advice of your primary healthcare physician. But because of some of the disparities, there are a lot of African-American families that don't have a primary physician. So they either have to go to urgent care or to the emergency rooms to try to seek, which are overcrowded and overloaded right now. So I think that testing is something that we have to demand. I know the Congressional Black Caucus is also demanding data because some states are not collecting the racial data. And I know you, in a later program, you're going to talk to some legal analysts about the legal consequences also of the coronavirus.
Final question. Politics abounds right now. There's a lot of criticism directed towards the president of the United States because of the way he is messaging this coronavirus and how he conducts the coronavirus task force news briefings. What do you say about, let's get beyond the politics and the noise, what do you say about his program? Is he doing enough? What more can he do? What would be your message to the president of the United States?
Well, I would join Governor Cuomo and other governors that we need more testing. We cannot go back to what he refers to as the normal, the way it was before March 1st, 2020. We cannot go back to that time in life, in business, and in our society without more testing. In fact, if we go back without the increased testing, it's going to increase the pandemic. And rather than going down or flattening, we're going to have a sharp increase in infections if we don't take the proper precautions. And the first stage of the proper precautions is to get tested. So I would say to President Trump and to his federal task force, and this is coming from the NNPA coronavirus task force, we need more testing.
Absolutely. We do need that. And Dr. Benjamin Chavis, thank you always for being on this program. And we are all working on this together. So let's keep pushing the envelope and telling people get tested and demand more testing, as well as to be responsible and accountable for what's happening in our own individual lives so that we protect ourselves as well as our family and our community.
Absolutely. Let's keep pushing, keep the faith, and stay together.
All right. Thank you, sir. Back with more of the show after this. Welcome back to the program. Joining me now is Shaka Senghor, who is an author, a lecturer, but what an incredible man. Faith and due diligence and courage. He joins me now to weigh in on the issue of what's happening throughout our America as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic, and certainly what's going on within those who are incarcerated. He himself had been incarcerated at the age of 19. We'll let him explain the story, but he's also the author of Righting the Wrongs, as in getting the right words out there to influence us and encourage us. And certainly at a time like now, we need some encouragement. Shaka, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today and looking forward to sharing just my thoughts with your audience.
Well, we got a lot to talk about, and I want to devote the next three segments of this show to your story because it's quite an incredible journey that you've had. And it's one that I think is indicative of the tough times come our way. But as you stated, in the midst of adversity, one thing you can always offer people is hope. And that's what I'm hoping we can do in our conversation. So, Shaka, what happened to you at the age of 19 that changed your life forever?
Yeah, so I want to take you back just a few years. I grew up in the city of Detroit. I was an honor roll scholarship student growing up in a household that on the outside looking in looked like the model for Black middle class, working class America. Unfortunately, like it happens in a lot of households, I was dealing with some divorce situation with my parents and abuse, and I decided to run away. When I ran away, I was just a naive kid. You know, I thought somebody would take me in, and unfortunately, that didn't happen. And I found myself being seduced into the crack cocaine culture. This was when crack first hit the Midwest around 1986. Within the first 6 months of being in that culture, I experienced every imaginable horror that comes with it. My childhood friend was murdered. I was robbed at gunpoint. I was beaten nearly to death. And I continued on in that culture. It's a very seductive culture that keeps you kind of entrapped in a way psychologically. And, you know, I was a kid. You know, I was looking for all the things that kids at that age look for: validation, love, acceptance. And 3 years later, at the age of 17, I was shot multiple times, standing on the corner of my block. I was rushed to the hospital. I was patched up. They took two of the bullets out, left one of the bullets in, and I was right back to my neighborhood. And not one psychologist, social worker, psychiatrist, doctor asked me what was I thinking, what was I feeling. And what I know now that I didn't know then is that I was experiencing PTSD. I was very paranoid. I didn't feel safe. And so I began to carry a gun every day. 16 months later, I got into a conflict about 2 o'clock in the morning, and it was a drug transaction that I refused to make that escalated into an argument. And within moments, I had an opportunity to walk away. And when that argument escalated, I turned and fired several shots, tragically causing a man's death. I was arrested, charged with open murder, and eventually convicted and sentenced to 17 and 40 years in prison for second-degree murder. I was 1 month into my 19th birthday at the time.
Wow. And how did you get through that? And what are you doing today to help so many people avoid that kind of lifestyle and that kind of violence that leads to becoming our brother's killer instead of our brother's keeper?
So three things happened during my journey of incarceration. I call them my three miracles. One, I met some of the most incredible mentors in the world. These are men who are currently dying in prison. These are men who have been in prison for over 40 years in some cases. And they saw something with books. You know, books became my companion in prison. It wasn't an overnight thing. You know, it took me a while to really figure out that my life could have purpose. But that was the first miracle. The second miracle was I received a letter from the woman who raised the man whose life I was responsible for taking. And in that letter, she told me who David was. She told me the father, the friend, the son. But she also told me how I devastated their family. And I remember reading that letter and thinking to myself, I just wanted to ball it up and it all go away. But I kept reading. And in the letter, she said, not only did she forgive me, but she actually loved me. And at that point in my life, I didn't even love myself, but it was something about her words that stuck with me. I kept that letter. I would read it often. And eventually I got to a space where I was able to forgive myself, but that wouldn't have happened without that letter. And then the third and final thing was receiving a letter from my son. At the time, his mother had told him while I was in prison. And it was something about reading the words from my son. And when he opened the letter, he said, my mom told me you was in prison for murder. Don't kill, Dad. Jesus watches what you do. And, you know, I'm not a religious person now. I wasn't, you know, that religious person then. I'm very spiritual. But it was something about those words coming from my child and this innocence that really made me realize that whether I was getting out of prison or not didn't matter. I just still had a responsibility to show him an example of what a man could be when he decides to turn his life around. And I owed him a father. And so I was committed to living my life differently.
Shaka, that's an amazing story. It's incredible. And God bless you for getting through it and then not burying it, but bringing it out in the open so that we all can learn, not only within the African American community and communities where people of color exist, but throughout the entire world. I'd like you to stay with me because at the next segment, we'll talk to you about your outreach, your TED Talks, your affiliation with Oprah, and how she has stepped in as well, and just how many people you're influencing, man. So stay with us, everyone. We'll be back with more of the program and more of the Shaka Senghor story. Quite a story. Stay with us. Welcome back to the program. I'm talking to Shaka Senghor because we're living in a heightened time of high anxiety and stress. And some people are just losing their minds because of what's going on with this COVID-19 pandemic. And certainly, if you've been watching what's going on with this Shaka Senghor story, you realize that here is a brother who has been through it all, has overcome it, and he's got some good information for each and every one of us to not only be informed, but inspired. And so Shaka, at the beginning, we were talking about what happened to you leading up to the murder, and then what happened to you beyond while you were still in prison. And what struck me was the visits that you had from three people who awakened you, including the one important message from your son. And now from that, you have made it kind of your own crusade, if you will, to go out and help change lives. It's so much so that you've garnered the attention from Oprah. Tell me what that experience was like and how you've gone on beyond that.
Yeah, when I got that letter from my son, I began this journey of really reimagining life for myself. At the time, I was serving time in solitary confinement, where out of the 19 years, I spent a total of 7 years. I just calculated the days last night, and it was 4,197 days in solitary confinement.
Wow.
It's 23-hour lockdown, 5 days a week, 24-hour lockdown, other 2 days. And in that environment, I just began journaling, and journaling made me realize that I had never completed anything in my life. And so I challenged myself to write a book. I wrote my first book in solitary. I got out. I went on to write about 4 more books while I was in prison. And then when I was released, I would go sell those books out the trunk of my car. And people would always ask me, like, how did I become a writer? Or they would say, hey, you sound really intelligent for somebody who's been in prison. And I was like, well, what do you think people in prison are really like? And that's what inspired me to write my memoir, Writing My Wrongs, because I really wanted to take people inside what happens to lead young men and women down that path. And as a mentor to a lot of kids across the country now, I understood that, their experiences was what my experience was back then. And if they didn't have intervention, they would likely end up on that same path. So I wrote that book. I originally self-published it in 2013, sold it out the trunk of the car, hustled it wherever I spoke at. And one time I was speaking at an event, and a woman, she got the book, she read it, and she took it to Oprah. And originally Oprah said that she didn't want to read the book because the cover was gritty and tough looking. And when she was getting ready to move from Chicago to LA, she decided to take the book with her. She read it. She was 60 pages in. It was like, I got to interview this guy. And so she interviewed me on Super Soul Sunday some years ago. And her and I actually became friends after that. And so when everything happened with COVID-19, I had wrote a piece about, here's the 8 things I learned in solitary that can help you survive quarantine. And I sent it to her, and she read it, and she was like, you got to talk about this on her new platform, Apple Talks. And so, she's been an advocate, she's been an ally, and she's been a real friend in the most genuine way. She really cares about what's happening in our judicial system. It's something that, she's been awakened to, and she's used her platform. If you watch her show, Queen Sugar, produced by Ava DuVernay, who's an incredible friend as well.
Yeah.
The character was formerly incarcerated, and, they're talking about criminal justice. So, to be able to get people to see the value in those that society has thrown away is really important to me, because my friends are still in prison. And especially during times now where it's really scary for them, given what's happening on the inside. So I just try to use my voice as a writer, as a speaker. When I wrote the piece for Medium, I was just saying, hey, how can I be most helpful given that we're all quarantined? And I was like, well, I got a little bit of experience of being isolated. And there's some things that I learned through that isolation that I think can be helpful to people, and those things include meditation, journaling, writing letters, finishing that book you want to finish, learning a new skill set, going back to school, in a sense of like, we live in an age where you can access information easily and learn new things. So I just wanted to offer something that lifts people up, that helps them regain some sense of control of their lives. Because that's the scary thing about now, everything feels so uncertain. Right. And that's what challenges people. It's like when you're in a space of uncertainty, it's hard to feel balanced. And, the reality is you can only control what you control. So I try to get people to focus on that.
Shaka, I appreciate you so much for sharing these valuable insights to keep us inspired on how we can cope with quarantine and how we can cope with these stay-at-home orders and this new normal that's quite abnormal in the space of COVID-19. I'd like you to stay with me. We're going to come back with more of Shaka Senghor, who's going to talk and address what's going on in our criminal justice system and incarcerated people in the age of COVID-19. Very valuable information coming up next on The Kelly Wright Show. Welcome back to the program. So I've been talking to Shaka Senghor, and we've heard his dramatic story, and we're seeing what he's done with his life and turning it around, doing something great, something positive, and even advising us and encouraging us on how we can deal with quarantine situations and stay-at-home orders in the wake of COVID-19. And Shaka, as you know, the COVID-19 pandemic is really adversely impacting the African-American community in terms of deaths, and that's because of our health disparities. And those disparities were there long before this started, and we're going to face them even after coronavirus is over. But the one thing that we haven't talked enough about, particularly on this program, is what's happening to those who are incarcerated. Is there enough attention being applied to how we can protect those who are incarcerated in this age of COVID-19 because of the close quarters in which they live in, those cells, and the fact that the virus can spread so swiftly throughout prison populations?
What we're faced with right now is a humanitarian crisis powder keg inside our prisons. What
Mm.
I found through phone calls from my friends is that, the response to what's happening out here isn't as robust on the inside. And so I've partnered with organizations. Just recently, I partnered with the Reform Alliance, headed by Van Jones and Jessica Jackson, and supported by Jay-Z and Meek Mill. And I was able to raise $100,000 through a donor to get masks and supplies into Rikers Island in New York, Parsons prison in Mississippi, and the county jail in Tennessee. But that's just literally like a drop in the bucket of what's really needed. So I'm working feverishly right now to help get resources for other organizations serving the prison population. From the phone calls, I'm talking to friends. So it's a very interesting thing to talk to my friends who I've known for years. We grew up in prison together and they're still in there. And to hear these men trembling in their voice with fear that they are basically facing an imminent death if something doesn't happen, because right now in some of the prisons, the way that they're managing it is if a person who's in one pod even shows symptoms, then they just quarantine that whole pod, which means that they're basically just subjecting people to the virus who may not even have it, as opposed to isolating the person. And they don't have the freedom to socially isolate. If you're in a 2-man cell or you're in a 16-person cube or even more, there's the lower levels, there's like just hundreds of people in an open space and sharing community showers and community restrooms. And one friend told me he got into an altercation with an officer because he was cleaning the bathroom with bleach, even though it's not his job. But he just said he refused to sit around and wait to be impacted by the virus when he can, do whatever he can of his own to try to clean. So it's a very desperate situation. The complex thing about America's prison system is we have over 50 prison systems in America. Every state is different. Every county is different. Every city is different. And so what we're trying to do is encourage governors, encourage wardens to release those who can safely transition back to the community, who probably shouldn't be in prison in the first place, and then to figure out the ways to create some social distance for those who are currently inside by, decreasing the prison population. And so there's efforts underway throughout the country, some incredible organizations to think about: Reform Alliance, Cut 50, Anti-Recidivism Coalition, also known as ARC. They're just doing incredible work. Even an organization at a university I taught at, University of Michigan, Prison Creative Arts Project, they're doing just great work to try to support men and women coming home. And what my role is now at this point is to try to gather resources for them. So I'm finding money and donors, and people are donating gloves and whatever they can. But we have to be thoughtful about what's happening, because history is watching right now and it's waiting to see who we really are. Either we're going to show ourselves to be really courageous and forward thinking, or we're going to just show ourselves to be really cowardly and inept at responding to crisis of this magnitude. And I think that, in my opinion, and knowing the people and the resilience of the people in this country, I think that we'll be the former, and we'll find our courage and figure this thing out. And so I'm just appreciative of you even creating a platform that allows us to tell our stories and to be transparent. And one of the biggest things is our community lives in fear of people in prison. And I really want to dispel those myths. That's why I talk about it so openly and talk about my life, because my life could have had any outcome if some interventions would have been in place. And I know this to be a fact because I see it in other young kids who are going down the wrong path until they encounter a mentor who comes from a shared background and experience that helps them get back on the right path. So that was my inspiration for writing a book, and it's why I try to tell the stories in the most humane way as possible.
Chuck, I love what you're doing. You got to come back on as often as possible.
Absolutely.
Bring your friends. Let's talk about this. This is a conversation that America has to have, especially as it relates to the incarcerated population, which sadly is predominantly African American and people of color. And yet we don't even represent the lion's share of the population in America. And there's a whole lot we can get into right now, but let's save that and table that for when you come back on. But man, I got mad love for you and mad respect for what you're doing to save our youth, to save our nation. and to save people who are incarcerated, because what you're doing is really what your son was talking about. You're doing God's work because you're caring for the least of these. And those are the forgotten ones, those who are behind bars. And yet they deserve as much protection as those of us on the outside do as well. So I appreciate you bringing that to light. Criminal justice reform, it's got to we got to keep focus on that as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, and looking forward to collaborating in the near future.
You got it, my brother. Shaka Senghor, much love to you. Godspeed. God bless you.
All right,
We've
peace,
got
bro.
more of the program after this. Welcome back to the program. As you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has hit virtually every state throughout America, and California, the most populous state in the country, is no exception. Joining me now from San Francisco is Dr. Carolyn Scott Ransom. And Carolyn, I appreciate you joining us today. You have not been tested for COVID-19, but I understand you are showing the symptoms. What's that been like?
Kelly, thank you. It's been scary, and just to the point of not knowing, that type of scary. I immediately started working, doubling up on antioxidants, but I didn't have the fever, but I had other symptoms, the dry cough once in a while, but no mucus or anything. However, the aches and other symptoms that have been mentioned, but those of us that had no temperature, we did not qualify for testing, and we're told to stay home, quarantine, and continue treating ourselves. So that went on, and I am just so grateful that I had just tons of things to hold down a temperature in case it came, the antioxidants, tons of green tea, and then 12.5 alkaline water, which became my great friend. Just moving through that was very hard because it went into places that were scary, vertigo and dizziness, and with that lightheadedness, not being able to balance myself, and almost crawling at times. But after a couple of days of really just downing things, I felt better, could get up, could operate, think about, cleaning and doing things, but continued working on building up my immune system because it had been compromised in a way I just could not believe. And I'm still doing that, and I got better within a few weeks. However, on Easter Sunday, I had a visitor, and it was a family member that's challenged, lives in the streets, and wanted to come in because he always gets a dinner here. There's always hugs. And I had to tell him I couldn't, and it broke my heart, broke his heart. And when he began to weep, I thought, Lord. However, I could not compromise. I had a student here and still have her here. And so I had to send him away. And talking to him from the window through a screen, couple of hours later, the symptoms came back from the very beginning that I had experienced. And so there again, Sunday night and Monday, I was battling, trying to get better, at risk, but they're so challenged.
Indeed. Now, that would suggest that it's airborne, as some doctors have actually claimed on this program. In addition to that experience, Dr. Scott, you had also talked about how you had attended an event, and some of those members that you attended the event with are no longer among us because of coronavirus. virus.
True. Sad. We had something like a reunion. It was a birthday party and thing that a lot of the baby boomers come to, and had just an amazing fun time. Had no idea there was nothing there that would make us think it was dangerous or we were at risk. This was prior to the shutdown, sheltering in place. And you were allowed, if your gathering was 100, to be together. So we decided people were flying in, we would go ahead and show up and honor city leader, and there were other leaders there. And we did, had no idea. It happened so quickly. Some of the people flying out got off the plane and ended up in a hospital on ventilators, and they got better. So we're very grateful. We're prayerfully checking on one another continuously and carrying on with what we do.
Dr. Scott, it's good of you to join us, and I know you're doing a great work out there. You've been trying to help people who are battling this illness, this virus, and I appreciate you so much for coming on and sharing some insights in terms of what's happening in San Francisco. It's a beautiful area, a lot of great people out there, and we're praying for you as always. And anytime you want to come on this program, you're always welcome.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And thank you for your program and for getting the good news out there.
Well, thank you for that. Appreciate you so much. We'll be back with more of the Kelly Wright Show after this. Welcome back to the program, and my oh my, have I got a great guest for you now, Lisa Shepard-Stewart, who is the owner of Cultured Expressions. And Lisa, so good of you to join us today.
Thanks for having me, Kelly.
I'm delighted to have you. Now, you're based in New Jersey, and of course, as we know, New Jersey and New York have received a high degree of disruption due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the disruption to one's health because of the number of deaths that have taken place in neighboring New York, and also what's happened to the economy. But you run a business that seems to be thriving instead of going through a downturn. Tell me what you do and why it's thriving.
Okay, well, Cultured Expressions is based on my passion for sewing, my passion for African fabrics. And what it does is it gives at least as far as the physical studio, gives people a space to come and take workshops, learn how to sew, learn how to quilt. And again, all using African fabrics. So it's kind of a unique spin on the basic traditional quilt shop, and it's a lot of fun. Been in business for 20 years, but the studio itself is about 2 years old now. And it's just, we've been having a great time. But sewing in general really seems to thrive in times of economic downturn, if you want to put it that way.
Wow.
People turn back to their sewing machines, they turn back to gardening, to cooking, a lot of the quote unquote home skills, if you want to call it that. And there's a big resurgence in this particular case because everybody that I know is sewing face masks. They don't take a whole lot of experience to sew. People want to feel useful and needed, whether it's just for their families or for first responders. We're seeing a lot of people coming in looking for fabrics to do exactly that and looking for elastic. And it's just been one of those weird spins where you're not sure what kind of company is going to thrive, but here we are and we're swamped. It's crazy.
Tell me the love that you have for African art and the cloth and the material. There's so many vibrant colors, and you take tours to Ghana and certainly for any of us who have traveled to Africa, it gets in your blood, in your bones, and you can't escape how rich our culture is throughout the African diaspora.
That's true. For me, my first trip to Africa, to the continent itself, was Senegal in 1986.
Yeah.
And then I got stuck on Ghana. Ghana has so many different types of fabrics. I haven't been able to get anywhere else yet. I need to get to Mali and other places. we go to Ghana every year, Glenn and I, so I can do my shopping. And we'd also taken some group trips there, taking groups there to explore and experience what we experience. That's been a great thing too. I haven't done that in a few years, but every year I do go for my shopping and to meet up with my artists and get reacclimated and get my creative fix. So it's a lot of fun.
Well, I just love that you've brought us some joy and you brought back sewing, because it's one of those things that all of us should learn how to do. I'm a little good with when it comes to sewing something if I need it, but my wife always steps in to actually say, get out the way, let me handle this.
Okay, you're not ready for your test then. Okay, I'll come back to you.
Ready yet. But I am ready for an Africanized mask to wear. That would, if we got to wear it, look at that. That's beautiful.
We actually make ours to be reversible too. There's the regular pleated style, and we make it so you can wear one color one day, wash it, and then wear the other color the next day, like a 2-in-1 with the basic.
I have to order those for the entire family, Lisa.
See, now there's the problem. I started making them for people. I had to stop production so I could really focus on the kits, because my real passion is getting people to do their own.
Yeah.
So I have what I call my tribe, my regular customers. We have new customers coming in that are dusting off their sewing machines and really want to get started. So it's really been an interesting twist here. It's been really fun.
And for people trying to get in touch with you, how do we do that?
They can reach us online at culturedexpressions.com. That's the website. We're also on Instagram and Facebook under Cultured Expressions. And under YouTube, you'll find the mask making video on YouTube under CE Fabric Videos on YouTube. So you can reach us all kinds of ways.
Listen, I'm so delighted that you came on the program today, and it's good that we can see what you're doing to lift up our spirits, and it's also good that your business is thriving in this crazy economy that we're all experiencing right now because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So be encouraged and keep encouraging others, which I know is something that you do. Got to get your husband on to play, because he is a bad boy when it comes to the keyboards.
He definitely is.
All right. She is Lisa
me.
Stewart. Thanks for being on the program.
Stay safe, Kelly.
Love to you.
Thank you.
All right. Be safe.
Bye-bye.
We're back with more of the Kelly Wright Show after this. Welcome back, and now for my final word. As we've seen tonight, there is cause for concern about testing, getting enough tests out there. There are also bright spots where people within the African American community who own their own businesses are actually thriving. And then there's a concern about what's going on in our prison population. We should continue to raise the flag and sound the alarm about what's happening there so that we can avoid a humanitarian crisis. And finally, my friends, hopefully we've been righted, united, and ignited to keep spreading knowledge and love and freedom and peace, not fear. We leave you now with a friend of mine, Keith Childers, a great recording artist, who leaves us with this song, It's Gonna Be All Right.
When my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. No matter what you're facing today, it's gonna be all right. It's already worked out. So that means if it's all right, it's gonna be all right. And just take these words with you and let it bless your life. Know that God's on your side. Sing it, girls. Come on, y'all.